Well, just wait for Ian to come in and then we can start. Welcome. I have a confession to make. We had a power cut this afternoon at Slights, and so what I thought was saved as a PowerPoint is not saved. So there's no visual aids today, I'm afraid. So I apologise. For that. So there was a power cut, so it didn't save. No, so it didn't save at home, so it didn't kind of transfer to my OneDrive. So, yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely. So, but I have prepped it, as you can see. So there's a couple of things today. Firstly, I thought what we'd try and do is put the things that we've learnt or we've discussed over the kind of 5 weeks or 4 weeks kind of into practice, which I'm very apprehensive about this because I'm particularly picking out probably, I think, the worst passage in the Bible for us to actually look at, or the worst kind of, and by worst, what I mean is it's the most kind of, I struggle to find a purpose for it being in, shall we say. So we're going to, towards the end, have a look at that. It's from the book of Judges. And so we'll kind of, I'm going to break it down into various bits for you to read and then discuss at various points. But before we do that, I thought we'd just have a look. Well, I've got my learning objectives, which would normally be up on the board there. The board. I've gone back into teacher mode, haven't I? In a minute, I'll be going. To get you all quiet. Yeah. Yeah. I remember getting into serious trouble when I was younger. We were in 5th year at school, and our first year, it was one of the first weeks, and our first year asked us where the toilet was. And one of my friends said, "Oh, you're in the big school now. There are no toilets. You have to actually go home." And we all got pulled in and absolutely rollicked, quite rightly as well, quite rightly. The aim of today is kind of to consolidate what we've learned about how we read the Bible, how we look at it, and to acknowledge that there are elements of our scriptures that don't sit comfortably with us as well. And also we're going to look at what the particular text we're looking at is part of it's one of what's called the texts of terror. There is a feminist theologian called Phyllis Tribble who writes specifically about the way in which if you read the Bible a certain way, you can come across as it being very patriarchal, very misogynistic, and it can cause a lot of problems. And that's why we kind of have this handle with care. And so there is a caveat that says that you need to protect yourselves. So if at any point when we're reading the text or discussing the text, you feel that it's too much, then if you would like to kind of bow out, that's fine. And I'll happily come and have a prayer with you at that point. Because some of it's not a nice passage, shall we say. And so then, but the question is, we know that that's in the Bible, so how do we cope with those kinds of texts? What do we do with those kind of texts in the Bible? We're going to start with a little bit of a discussion, and I just want you to think about how, where, and when you hear or read the Bible in your everyday life. So where are the places that you study the Bible? Do you do Bible readings in the morning? Do you do them in the evening? Do you hear it at church? All those kind of things. Just have a think about where you hear it, and if there's any particular, we used to do a Bible study that was called Every Day with Jesus, or as we called it, Every Other Day with Selwyn, or Once in a While with God. Because that's the kind of frequency that it ended up by the end of the time. So yeah, it was always Selwyn Hughes, and then we moved on to Jeff Lucas. So it might be that you are only getting that perspective. So that's the kind of thing I want you to think about when you're talking about or discussing where you hear the Bible or where you read the Bible, about maybe the different slants that you get across the course of your week or year of reading it. I'll give you about 5 minutes just to have a chat about that. Okay, if you can just be wrapping up. So, does anybody want to share any feedback about where or how they read the Bible or hear the Bible?
I was saying that the Old Testament God is so different to our Lord. And I was saying the bit about going into Canaan and annihilate them, I think it doesn't sit right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so you puts you off reading those bits that and the lectionary is wonderful at that. The lectionary, anything that's a little bit contentious or a little bit, ooh, that's harsh, we'll just skip that bit. I used to do a thing when I was younger, when I was in church, and it would say, the lectionary reading today is from John's Gospel, chapter 7, verses 1 to 9, and then verse 26. I'd be like, what's the bit in the middle? Let me look at why we're not talking about that. But yeah, the lectionary does that all the time. If it's difficult, we just won't add it because we've only got 52 weeks and we can't get through it all. So let's cut out the really difficult bits. Anybody else want to share?
I was just saying my latest big interaction with Scripture was on Good Friday, listening to Bach's Matthew Passion and Handel's Messiah. And there's a lot of great theology in both.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think music is, I mean, as Methodists, the Anglicans had their stained glass windows. For those people that couldn't read, they could see the stories in the stained glass windows. For Methodists, we sang it. So we sing our theology, which is why some of those Wesley tunes are just, Wesley words are so deep and so kind of rich. And almost every line in a Wesley hymn has some link to a scriptural text. It's they are incredible works of theology. I think I might be biased, but having to do a whole module of sitting down and going through them all, it's yeah. Anybody else want to share?
I was just saying that I'm not very consistent with my Bible reading. I always start off with good intentions, and they sort of fly out the window fairly rapidly. And I would like to be more consistent. I mean, that's me generally. But I do try.
No, I used to, when I was younger, set off on a big, right, I am going to read the Bible in a year. I'm going to do the whole Bible. And by about the second week, partly because of my ADHD, I was like, that's it's too big a project, or really I can't be bothered, and it would just fizzle out. And that's why we had the every day with Jesus that became every other day with God, and then once in a while with Selwyn, or whatever we used to say. Jackie used to kind of encourage me to do it, and I was like, yeah, but I'm tired. And good intention. You find these people that kind of get up at 3 a.m. Yeah. They read kind of like 5 chapters. They write 16 hymns, and they do a prayer walk on the beach all before 9 o'clock in the morning, and it's like. Yeah, I can't get my head around that.
No, I was going to say, I wasn't putting my hand up to say I got up at 3 a.m. Ian's only just going to bed then, so no. But no, I think I have a sort of a rebellious nature towards people that do that, and so I struggled to then. First of all, I probably felt shame that I thought, I should be doing that. That's the way I should be. As a Christian, this is what you're brought up with, and there's people around you that do all this and tell you about it and how good they are at it. And I just, it just used to irk me. So it wasn't that I didn't want to read the Bible, I just didn't want to do it like them. So
I was really brilliant until I got married. Nice, very, very good, solid, quiet time in the morning over my coffee. And then I got married, and he's a morning person, so that stuffed it completely. Then you have kids, then you do junior doctor jobs, and then it all just goes completely to pot, and then you feel a bit guilty because, you've been brought up to do it. But then after 40 years of marriage, Lectio popped up, and something which is short, snappy, has a bit of a psalm, bit of something else, bit of a commentary. You can listen to it if you want to, if you just want to carry on dozing. I mean, if you want to kind of concentrate. Doesn't take very long, and I can attach it to something in the day. And I just find it sets me up for the day. It's dead simple. And so I think it was Georgette, actually, who put that on one of the chats during COVID. And I just thought, I think I could do that, actually. But thinking about, the Jeff Lucas stuff, where do you hear it coming up through sort of Spring Harvest and stuff, there was definitely an approved reading list of commentary. And one of the things over the last 2 or 3 years I've just revelled in is starting to read other people's commentaries that have really started to tackle these difficult bits. And, so one author I've really, really just delighted in is called Rachel Held Evans. And she's written a book called Inspired, actually, talking about her journey away from the Bible and back to it, and tackles exactly the sort of thing that Phil's just said. And has got this fantastic phrase, which I'm going to say, is that, she says, well, if God allows his children to write the story, well, sometimes that's the sort of thing you'll get. And I just found that enormously helpful. So broadening the different views on it has been really helpful for me and sort of strengthened me, I think, in the inspiration I find from the Bible.
Yeah, I was kind of brought up in the church that was, guilt tripped you if you didn't read it every morning. And I love the idea of something that's audio, something that's kind of, that you can listen to as you're doing something else. For me, I get in the car and I put on an audio book or, something that kind of gets a lot of my I'll put on a theological textbook on Audible. And, and I won't say bomb. If Jackie gets in the car, it's pretty boring if I've got that on. And definitely if the kids are in, it's like, no, we have to have Matthew's music on. But something that you can listen to that actually you can do in those down times when you wouldn't be doing, where you've got the space, in a sense, I think is really useful. Rachel Held Evans is outstanding. Honestly think that her work is, she came from a very, very kind of conservative, evangelical, fundamentalist church upbringing, and I think she really struggled, and that being able to see a different viewpoint, actually, Brian McLaren has a book called Faith After Doubt, which is all about that idea of kind of when we struggle and we have to make kind of decisions about, especially coming from a science background, when you've got a scientific decision to make, but the church you belong to is telling you one thing that doesn't fit with what you understand in the scientific world. That sense of then deconstructing or having to say, do you know what? It's either I forget the science or I forget the religion. And actually we don't need to do that. We just need to be able to kind of consolidate the two and see them as different elements within the same picture. So for me, science always says the how, and God and the Bible says the why. And if you look at it with those lenses, you see a slightly different viewpoint. You can see, and certainly the passage that we're looking at today, the why is very important. Why does it make it in? And I think that's really one of the things we need to look at when we're reading Scripture. Why is this here? Especially the difficult passages. And what can we learn from those passages, which often seem horrendous? As opposed to it being, oh, well, that must be how we are supposed to behave or act or whatever. But yeah, I agree with the agreed reading list was you can't possibly look at them because they're liberal or they aren't Christians. And it kind of stops that being able to see the wider picture and understand that actually we see through different lenses, and actually we can learn from all of those kind of lenses. I'm glad you talked about Rachel Held Evans and the if God lets his people write the stories, what can you expect? Because that's kind of what I want to go into briefly. The idea of stories. And stories are really, really important. And it's part of, I have this kind of mindset that says the Bible is the Bible. But actually, it stops at Revelation. And everyone has a story. And our stories don't make it into a book. But actually, we can learn so much from one another by listening to our stories, by listening to how we've got where we are, by listening to the things that we have experienced. And certainly, as you know, I love my films. So I look at films like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or The Matrix. And in them, I see spiritual truths. In them, I see something that God is saying to me. There's a beautiful clip when Dumbledore's just died. Spoiler alert if anybody hasn't seen the films. Where the whole kind of school gather around this body on the floor, and McGonagall stands there. There's a dark mark up in the sky, and it's really down. It always makes me think of kind of that sense of Good Friday, that it's really down. It's a really sad ending, and McGonagall stands there, and she puts her wand in the air, and she lights it. And as all the other students do it, the dark mark disappears as all the lights kind of come out. And it's that sense of, for me, that idea of the light in the dark, the light dispels the darkness. Even in the darkest night, the smallest light can shine. And in those images, I know we had a minister who went to see that film and came out saying it was so depressing, so down. And then we found out that she hadn't seen any of the other films leading up to it, and she hadn't read any of the books. So we're like, well, going to see the sixth film, or was it the fifth film? The fifth film out of a series of 7 is not a good place to start. Not a good place to start at all. But stories are not just kind of for now. We have our films, we have books, but historically, that's how information got passed. Because people remember stories. People remember the narratives. People remember the little nuances. So moral truths and spiritual values were taught through stories from the earliest days. I imagine that, cavemen and women would be telling their children stories about the dangerous mammoth. Don't go near the dangerous mammoth because he'll trample you. In my life, I think of the stories, the boy who cried wolf. It's a story about don't tell lies, because if you build on the lie and you're building it, when something bad does happen, nobody's going to believe you. Matthew, bless him, for years was terrified about telling lies. When he was little, obviously, was terrified about telling lies because he'd seen the VeggieTales. I can't remember what it was called, Larry and the Fib from Outer Space, and he kind of thought, oh, if that happens, then the Fib will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it'll be a monster. We tell our truths through stories, and that's not just kind of in our spiritual world, but psychologists say that we do that for a good reason. Anthropologists say that society has done it for a good reason. We remember those things that spark us or interest us or excite us, and stories definitely do that. So within those ideas of stories, we get social cohesion and bonding, we get groups forming. So if you think about from a religious perspective, you have the Christian story. So the Christians gather around our story, and we have our Apostles' Creed, which I think misses out a huge chunk of Jesus's life, but is still part of what the church believes. And we kind of use that to say, if you can believe these things, you're part of our dynamic, you're part of our social group. For other religions or other groups, there's the same identity, the same kind of idea that the identity is linked up with the values and the stories that we tell of ourselves. We pass on cultural knowledge through our stories. So we pass on that idea of, I often tell stories about my granddad. In the Navy, in the Merchant Navy, and in the Royal Navy during the war, and I tell stories about how he was served on ammunition ships during the Second World War, and how one of them crashed and was within a metre of blowing up the whole of Gibraltar. These stories that kind of they pass on, they're part of that cultural knowledge. We tell the stories of the Second World War, the First World War, the things that we hold to as our historical values. And so we have this issue that then when we have a multicultural society, we have different stories. And we have situations where within our schools or our churches, we're telling one story, but we need to be aware that we need to listen to the other stories. There was a band that I was really into back in the 80s called Extreme. They were brilliant. Nuno Betancourt on guitar was outstanding. And they had an album that was called 3 Sides to Every Story. And it was split up, yours, mine, and the truth. And that's the way our stories go. We tell them, we exaggerate certain bits, we make points that we want to emphasize. And we see that in our gospel accounts, that there's certain points that are really important to those writers, and so they emphasize those bits because that's what's really important to them. when I talk about Middlesbrough Football Club, I talk about, us winning a cup, and the penalty that Bull Zenden scored in the Principality Stadium that took us through into Europe as we won the cup. I don't say particularly that in 1997 we would dock, 1996 we would dock 3 points, which we still should have back, and that put us down. Those are stories that we play down the bits that we don't like, and we build up the bits that we do like. Stories allow us to develop, our brains to develop. We learn language skills. We need, if I was to put the Bible in front of some of the kids that I used to teach and ask them to read the word Nebuchadnezzar, they would struggle. Yet if we look at it now, because we're brought up in that story, we see the word and we recognize because we've heard it. We've heard that language used. I went to a church when I was younger with a friend of mine, to listen to a sermon, and it was a Baptist church, and it was a very heavy sermon. And we tried to sneak out after the service, and the pastor caught us. And the question he asked us both, as 17-year-old boys, was, "Have you been washed in the blood of the Lamb?" And I was like, "Sounds very messy. It sounds very messy and not particularly attractive." But those are languages that we use, and we need to be aware that when we use those languages, a lot of people don't recognize it. They don't see it in the context that it is. They don't see the metaphorical nature of it. And again, that's the same with some of our scripture. And also we get that idea of empathy and connectivity. So when we hear the stories, we empathize with the characters. We begin to learn those skills of being able to say, it must have been terrible for Thomas to arrive on the Monday morning to see his mates and them all say, "Oh, you should have been here yesterday." Jesus came in that door there. The doors were locked and he suddenly appeared in front of us. And obviously Thomas, as we're going to find out, as you're probably going to find out on Sunday, says, "Unless I put my fingers in his hands," we empathize with that because we miss out all the time. We have those moments where we missed out. One Good Friday, and my friend went surfing, and she rang me the next day to say, "You should have been there." We were out the back, and 3 dolphins came and jumped right in front of us. And I was like, "Yeah, I was on a Good Friday march." Those stories, those empathies, we can empathize with situations, and we learn to be able to understand other people through the stories that we hear and the stories that we tell. With all that in mind, we're now going to get onto some reading. As I said, this is not a nice passage. So if you do need to opt out at any point, then do. And if you want me to pray with you again, that's fine. I can do that. At the end of all these passages, I'm going to ask you to discuss. And what I want you to think about when you're reading through them are the elements that are like specific phrases that jump out to you, or situations, or the themes that are in the whole of that passage, or anything that doesn't sit right with you, or anything that specifically you notice, or any absences within the text that you notice. So the first section, these are all from Judges 19. Judges 19 and the first 10 verses. So Judges 19, the first 10 verses. It's in the Old Testament. Yeah. One to 10, yeah. 19. It should start with a story about a Levite. 19, 1 to 10. Easing you into this passage, as you can probably see, which is why I'm stopping at verse 10 for the time being. Does anybody want to say anything that they noticed specifically about that passage? Anything that jumps out at you, or?
Are there two men? So that you've got the Levite and then you've got the husband.
No.
Are they the same man?
They're the same man, yeah. Yeah, they're the same man.
What's the definition?
The porcupines, as I call them, the concubine is effectively, and this is kind of quite difficult, is effectively classed as a lower. They are effectively treated, in a sense, as a wife, in that they're looked after, but they can bear heirs, but they're not particularly classed as legitimate, and they don't have the same social standing as a wife. So within the passage, as Christina pointed out, we see this transition. She's a concubine, but then she's classed as his wife. And the father-in-law is also in on the picture. So it's a very strange dynamic where we're jumping around all over the place. I explained to Matthew that basically the concubines are just classed as they're there as effectively sex slaves. They're property, they're chattels. They just belong to the husband. They're part of to the kind of the owner, the gentleman that classes maybe a husband. But don't have the social standing as a wife. They don't take the husband's name, and the children that are born. I suppose you could class it a bit like if you've watched Game of Thrones, where they have Jon Snow, who is. Yeah, yeah. So they don't have the same name. They don't have the surname. They're classed. They almost have a title that says you're not legitimate. You can't really. You can only inherit the father's position and power and lands if he has no other sons to his wife. So that's where the concubine comes. Yes. Yeah. So we're reading a text that is written in Hebrew, translated into Greek, translated into Latin, translated into English, and at various points, even if we go back to the original Hebrew, our understanding of specific words, as I talked about a few weeks prior, that idea that there may be no consonant, there may be no vowels in there may be no commas. So what we get is a picture that is kind of saying, well, they're a concubine, and so we're going to use the only way we can use the language of her going back to her father when we're relating to her father against her owner is to use those marital terms. I assume that's one of the ways it goes. But so we've got this language problem that's kind of wrestling against it. Does anybody notice anything about her father?
Well, either he's been. I can't work out whether he's kind of respects this guy or whether he's got some evil machination going on, which maybe we'll find out after.
I don't know. I mean, it could be that that's what he's trying to do. I think that there is within the kind of the Middle Eastern world at that time, and even today, a sense of what's called hospitality, that they have a big, they get their position through the hospitality that they give. And that's a really big theme that we're going to hear as we go on in the story. So we see her father providing no end of hospitality to this guy who basically owns his daughter. And he kind of, they eat together. He makes them breakfast. He kind of gives them the hospitality during the day. One of the other things that you might have noticed is what happens to the concubine's character and voice once the two men come into the picture. She's absent. As is her mother, that's right. So from that point on, there's no sense of her having any agency at all. Whatever happens now is down to her husband and her dad. She had the agency to leave, but once she got to her dad's and he came back, suddenly she disappears from the picture.
What comes over to me is immense gratitude of the father welcoming constantly the husband for perhaps taking on his daughter who was a concubine. It was sort of like gratitude, 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 stay, stay, stay.
Probably, yeah, because obviously it's another mouth to feed. And if she's with this gentleman, then he's feeding her, he's clothing her, he's putting her up in a tent. He's the one that's got all the responsibility. So there is this element of we don't know, there's very little information in the text about the father or the circumstances. It could be that he's got 7 other daughters that he's trying to kind of feed, or or that he's unable to work, or all sorts of things. So but there is that sense of she's back to being property, even when she goes back to her father's. And her father has this big discussion. There is an element of him trying to keep the guy at the house. So you could say, well, maybe he's trying to kind of, like, say, evil machinations, or even just trying to kind of delay her going back with him, which is a possibility, because eventually the Levite gets on his two donkeys and takes the concubine, and they go. And that's going to have a bit of a play in the story as we go through. I noticed there's somebody said on this table here, which is something that I hadn't noticed. What happens to the servant? He's in verse 11, right? So he comes back in verse 11. So yeah, supposedly he's sitting outside with the donkeys, making sure that the donkeys are looked after, whilst all this is going on. The first sentence. In those days, Israel had no king. Yeah, we're going to come on to that. It's because it's the book of Judges, and there's making a specific point about this wouldn't have happened if we had a king to rule over us. It's about we're at the point where we make our own decisions, and everybody has their freedom to do what they think is right. Whereas if we've got a king, they'll tell us what's right, and that comes out towards the end.
So do you think he was trying to make up for being unfaithful as well?
Possibly, yeah. That she'd run away could be, yeah, that could be on there as well. I mean, we hear, if we go back, forward, and we look at the book of Philemon, there's that sense of, the slave is sent back to the master, and you must be, contrite and do what your master tells you to do. That's another particular passage that, we could really, really wrestle with. Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah.
Isn't it possible that the father actually loves the concubine daughter anyway? Yeah. Because she'd been back home for 4 months. Yeah. He hadn't chucked her out. Yeah. And he's sort of, as I said earlier, trying to almost persuade the husband. To, yeah. So we're forgetting the fact that he may love them both.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of these things we can read into that text. All those things we can kind of get out of that information, that text. Okay, we're going to take a bit of a dark turn now, and we're going to go to verses 11 to 20. 11 to 20. I don't think it gets incredibly dark until a little bit later, but yeah, it's getting darker, shall we say. To 20, yeah. Okay, and the same questions for discussion. Is there anything specific that you notice? Any phrases? Any thing that doesn't sit right? Anything that jumps out at you? Yeah. He's a foreigner. Yeah, he's not from not a foreigner as such, but he's not from that particular place.
Because you get the impression there is no way that innocent people should be out after dark in this place. You know, it's almost like every good horror movie in that sense.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I know. That's another issue. I won't stay anywhere where there's no Israelites. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. From his own kind, yes. And he's had hospitality from the father-in-law, and now we see that hospitality from the old gentleman who is a visitor in that town, and says that no one's taken him in. That's right, because culturally that's what people did. You took somebody in that was a traveller, that you looked after them, you fed them. It was part of your duty as a Jewish citizen to do that, to look after those people who were in need. It is, well, yeah, it is. But I suppose because it's the expectation, maybe it's in that culture it was less risky because you were expecting it, and so you treated them as you would want somebody to treat you if you invited them into your house. Yeah. Yes. So again, like I say, it's starting to get a little. Why did nobody take this guy in other than the foreigner? Let's move on. 21 to 26, and it's now getting dark. It's getting really dark. So. Yeah. Up to 26.
Similar idea of marauding bands of sexually frustrated folk.
Yes.
We've got the thing which we mentioned time and time again, that women there's no value to the women in this story, because I'll protect the man, but I'll send out my daughter.
Yes.
And his concubine.
Yeah.
To be used in whatever way these people.
Yeah, that's right. So once again, at this point, we see very much that the women are property. The women have no agency and no right to refusal here. It's just straight away out. And one of the things that kind of I didn't notice until I was reading the book on this was that it's the man, the Levite, who pushes his concubine out the door. It's like, no, don't take me, take her. It reminds me a bit of Nemesis Subterra, Jackie, when we had those zombies attack and I left you and the kids and legged it to save myself. Yes, so this idea is these kind of women are property. They're pushed out. The men come to that. This is, like I say, it's very similar to Lot. It's almost the identical story, except it was angels that were visiting Lot. And this guy's a foreigner. Again, the women become dispendable. They just pass them on and push them out. And we get this horrific scene at the end.
There's something as well about he was willing to put out his virgin daughter.
Yeah.
Because I would imagine, in terms of dowries and stuff
Yeah.
like that, there would have been value insofar as his daughter was a virgin.
Yeah.
To marry her.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, yeah. This is self-preservation at the expense of those that you are supposed to look after. And one of the things that I want us to really focus on is just the phrase, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. That's really important when we see what the reaction later on is. Some of the wicked men. So if you hold that in kind of a little locker up here. So
Just a thought, it brings home, I mean, I know that it was several hundred years later when Paul was writing or wherever it is, but the instruction for husbands to love your wives, we just
Yeah.
say, yeah, right.
yeah,
But that was explosive.
yeah, yeah.
Nowhere were husbands meant to love their wives.
That's right. As Christ loved the church, and as Christ loved the church means dying. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. It's revolutionary for that time. The idea of in this situation, what Paul is saying is, and what I sense we would say, is that the man should have gone out, or they should have locked the doors and shuttered themselves in, or whatever. Not just said, well, as long as I'm all right, you can have them. So yeah, it's. Yeah. 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 Yes. It's not everyone in that town. Yeah. Yeah. Possibly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it brings home that this isn't about homosexuality.
No.
This is just sex as a weapon,
Yep.
as an instrument of terror.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Violate the guest in a way that
Yeah.
maximum horror.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. It's not. This is. It's literally to do with the idea of they want to humiliate, and they want to, control. There's some really interesting kind of elements to the theme so far. Is that from the concubine's point of view, she leaves a place that she feels is unsafe in her owner's husband's house. She returns to a place that is safe. Her father's house. The guy comes and gets her back and takes her, and they pass a place that potentially was safe, Jebus, onto a place that is supposed to be safe, and they get a sanctuary in the guy's house, the old man who invites them in. She then is pushed out from the safety back into a point of where she is vulnerable and attacked and raped and stuff. And then at the end of that bit of passage, at daybreak the woman went back to the house where her master was staying. She fell down at the door and lay there until daylight. So she is trying to return to that sanctuary, that place of supposed safety. I did say this was a dark passage. We're going to move on to 27 to 30. At 30. Yeah, end of the chapter. Yeah. Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse. There's a few bits here that, I don't know what jumps out to you, but there's a few bits here that really kind of fly under the radar a bit. So he gets up in the morning. The master gets up in the morning. He's gone to bed. Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah. So gets up in the morning. He opens the door of the house. So he's obviously ready to go, and he stepped out to continue on his way, and there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. So he says to her, "Get up, let's go." All right? Not how are you? Get up, let's go. Yeah. Puts her on the donkey and sets off for home. Yeah, throws her over the donkey. Put her on his donkey, yeah. Well, there was no answer, yeah. So we're not sure whether she is dead at that point or not. The question is, if she's dead, why does he put her on the donkey to take her home? Maybe he thinks he's going to give her a burial. Or maybe because he knows what he's going to do and cut her into 12 pieces. But at no point do we know whether the cutting up to 12 pieces is him killing her, because she no longer has the value that she had when she was his concubine, or whether she's already dead and he cuts her up into 12 pieces anyway. Yes, that's right. So when it says, it depends on we're reading from the NIV, but depending on whether it's the kind of the Greek or the Hebrew Bible of it, it says either sent them a piece to each of the tribes of Israel, or whether it's, just says distributed around Israel. And again, with the Greek and the Hebrew, where it says, everyone who saw it was saying to one another, such a thing has never been seen or done. Again, that's ascribed to a voice in either, I can't remember whether it's the Greek or the Hebrew, but it's not everyone says, it's someone said it. Never has it been seen before. Yeah. 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 It's a message to say, yeah. 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 Against him, that's right. So he's the one that's aggrieved. Yeah. To me, I have had a wrong done to me because my concubine has been... Never mentions that he's the one that pushed her out the door. Never mentions the fact that he's the one who cut her up. And potentially he's the one that killed her. We don't know from the text. It's such a thing has never been seen done, that this has happened to me. And so the others say, we must do something about this. Is it? Yeah. It could. Yeah, it could be. I mean, a lot of wishful thinking. I mean, a lot of Jesus's parables are like that. So when he says a man has 100 sheep, it's impossible. People didn't have 100 sheep in those days. It was like such a huge thing. But that's right. So it's So if it helps you to sleep at night, then yeah, it's not a nice passage. We've actually got time to look at the yeah.
Curious about the relationship of the Levites and Israelites. Are they different races?
Well, they're part of this. So if you think about Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat and all of the brothers that he had, they all effectively had a portion of land, so they became tribes. So the Levite tribe was like the people that came from Levi. The Benjaminites were people that came from Benjamin. So they're all kind of actually family. Yeah, the Levites were the ones that eventually went and became the priests in the temples. Yeah.
So really, they were a tribe of the Israelites.
Yes. Yeah. So they were people of Israel. That's right. So all of the kind of people mentioned are all Israelites as such.
So it's almost in-house incident.
Yeah.
Because it's one tribe of Joseph attacking another tribe.
Yeah.
Benjamin attacking the Levites.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a brotherly or a family squabble, a bit like the First World War. You know, that they were all from the same families that fought. So what happens next is Judges 20 to 21. It's quite long. If you would like, I can summarise it and paraphrase it. So basically, what happens is, at this point, has anybody noticed anything at all to do with God? No, he hasn't even been mentioned in any of this at all. Until this point, where we move into Judges 20 and 21, when they decide they're going to go to war. They're going to say, well, what we're going to do is, obviously, this is a despicable thing, so we're going to go to war, and we're going to go to war with the Benjaminites. As that obviously makes sense, because, you know, one person has been killed. Well, actually, that's not important, because one person has been wronged, the master of this concubine, and we want vengeance for that. So the Benjaminites, they need to apologize, and if they won't, then we're going to go to war for them. So basically, these 400,000 soldiers set off, and there's a big pitched battle. The Benjaminites won't apologize, presumably because it was like some men, not all Benjamites. They meant, this is what he says, this is what the master says. He continues with this interpretation. He says, they meant to kill me. They had asked instead to know him. So the Levites' understanding of their request is a legitimate one. Actually, that they want to have their way with me. They meant to kill me, and they ravished my concubine, and she is dead. So again, we get this reinforcement of the person that's been wronged is not the concubine. They wanted to have me, they couldn't have me, so they ravaged my concubine, and I'm now effectively out of pocket. No, he doesn't. It doesn't. It plays down his kind of involvement in the situation, and so he kind of absolves himself, makes it clear that he, oh well, this was, I didn't kick her out so that she could be to save my own skin. He says she's dead rather than they killed her. So, and rather than I killed her. So again, if she was killed, that's not what he's kind of particularly concerned about. It's like she's dead, not that fact of murder. And it kind of reinforces that idea that perhaps he was the murderer, as opposed to actually the guys who left her on the doorstep, or she crawled to the doorstep. So he tells a story about this abomination and wantonness in Israel. There's no retribution for him in terms of him fearing that it might come down on him at all, because he's the man and she's his property, so he can do with her exactly what he wants. So they all turn against the Benjaminites, and they go to war. And the tribes of Israel demand that Benjamin give the guys up, and they won't do it. So they have this big battle. And this is how the narrator describes this conflict. He says, thousands and thousands of men participated. Yahweh joined the fight against Benjamin. And after 2 initial defeats, the tribes gained this victory by kind of a bit of a ruse. They go into the town of Benjamin. They burn it down. And they kill every woman, child, and beast. And they annihilate the tribe of Benjamin with the exception of 600 men that escape. So his response for his being wronged, not for the concubine, the one woman who was kind of abused, raped, killed, results in the death of every woman, child, and man. So their response is to do significantly more to the people who were involved than had done to them. We kind of see why Jesus says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This is above and beyond what is kind of classed as would be acceptable recompense for being wronged. But then it gets worse, because they then have this real problem, because they've got 600 men who are Benjaminites out in the wilderness. And because of their kind of rules, these men they're Israelites. And therefore, they should be allowed to have wives. But they've made a pact that says that no woman from the fighting armies, from those regions, is allowed to be married to the Benjaminites. So what do? Well, what they do is they say all of the tribes that didn't fight with them will take their women. So they take over, they take 400 women from the town of Jabesh Gilead. They murder all of the inhabitants of that place, except for 400 young virgins, and they give those 400 virgins to the Benjaminites. But that's not enough, because the Benjaminites says, well, there's 600 of us, and you've only given us 400. So they go and they get another 200 from another tribe, and they hand those over. So the daughters of Shiloh, they get 200. So the rape and murder of one woman by a group of men leads to the rape and abuse of 600 women and the death and murder of entire tribes and villages. So how do we deal with that in our scriptures? How do we that's part of our Bible. And it's deemed to be an appropriate response in the Old Testament. In the book of Judges, it's kind of deemed to be.
Well, it's an account
Yeah.
of what the response is, but it doesn't say it's appropriate.
No. So therefore, do we interpret it to say it's literal and that was what was right to do? No. We look at it in our hindsight and say that's completely an inappropriate response. Yeah, it's vengeance. Yeah. Yeah.
You see it in small children, don't you?
Mm.
Take my child.
Yeah.
I'll whack you
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
It's that human nature. It's almost like Christ came to break that.
Mm. But I mean, I think the thing, yeah. I mean, we hear that account in Judges and what their response to it, but actually, if we go back forward, whatever, into kind of the Levitical laws, we actually see that was not in keeping with Levitical law. So they were even out of kilter with their own law in what they did. And I think there's a sense that as we read this, and we read that passage, we could read that passage in isolation and say, well, firstly, God's not involved in it. Very little mention of God in it, if any. So it wasn't God's will that they did that. It's not God's law that they did that. And when we look beyond Judges, we come back to that first sentence that Paul said, the idea of, when Israel didn't have a king. So the Judges are saying if we had a king, then there would be laws and there would be rules and they would be enforced and we wouldn't have this kind of behavior that's occurring and we wouldn't have all of these people put to death and that kind of mentality. The reality is, though, if we go to a time when they did have kings and we look at the time when they did have kings, it's no better.
But at the time of Judges, didn't God say the reason they don't have a king is because I'm the king?
Yeah, and they didn't want it. So they ended up getting a king from the Benjamites, and it didn't work out. And if we look at David, who is this wonderful, we get the whole Bathsheba on the rooftop, which then, there's 3 children that he has, and one of the oldest son, he has a son, a daughter, and a son, and the youngest son wants to sleep with his sister because he kind of likes her. And so we get these stories that keep coming back, and she gets pushed to, again, she becomes a commodity. She loses her agency. These things that, and so when we read those texts, we could take one slanted view on what the Bible is about. But if we take another view and say, well, let's look at the books that are juxtapositioned with that. We have the book of Ruth, which is pretty much right next door in one of the Bibles. It's right next door. We have the book of Ruth that talks about a Moabite, a foreigner, who comes and marries in. We get the whole sense of, well, they can't marry us. Well, actually, Ruth proves that they can. We get other books there that sing of this the wonderful, the role of women actually in the Bible, as we talked about several weeks back, actually does pass that test. Women are given agency. Women are given roles. And I think some of these passages are there to remind us that even today, if we think about what happened in Israel in October, when we see that, these things are still happen today. We don't have to go to Israel. We look all around the world, and sex is weaponized. Rape is used as a weapon of war. It's not supposed to be, but it is. Women still in places aren't given voices, aren't allowed to speak, aren't allowed to stay up. And what we say when we read passages like this one, which is horrific, that actually the response was such an extreme response that we see what happens when this situation occurs. If we let it run away with us, we end up, as was it Gandhi that said, if you want to, kill your enemy, dig 2 graves. That idea that's violence begets violence. And this is a reminder to us, in a sense, that a lot of these passages, that actually, firstly, we need to look at are we giving agency to people? Are we allowing people to have a voice? Or are there people within our societies that we kind of just say, well, they're just property. They don't really matter. We might not say that exactly, but we might say, oh, well, they don't really, they're not really important. The guy who sleeps on the street, well, why can't he get a job? Why doesn't he get a job? Or the single mum on benefits. It's like, well, she could put a kid in childcare, and yeah, absolutely, yeah. But that's the kind of we have those people that have no voice, that have no agency, that are classed as being by many people as just being kind of like flotsam jetsam, rubbish on the streets that we can dispose of. And when we see these passages in Scripture, they're horrific, and they remind us that actually it's almost like a wake-up call. Say, yeah, maybe we wouldn't do X, Y, or Z, but there are situations that we put ourselves in, or we find ourselves where we act in a manner that is not acting as a disciple of Jesus.
One of the things that's exercising me at the moment is that the Bible, we're kind of brought up to see the Bible as essentially about the relationship between God and people. And you talked in an earlier session about the the big themes of creation and fall and covenant and having to and I'm just wondering what the compilers of the Jewish canon thought that the book of Judges was, this bit of the book of Judges, this is the end of the book, And okay, so the punchline is there wasn't a king, right? But God in these 3 chapters is kind of co-opted by the Israelites, the non-Benjamite Israelites, after all this mayhem and chaos. And God's kind of sort of whispering in the background, okay, yeah, this is what you should do now. Get all these fighters together and you lot go first. And then there's a reference in the end, it's the Lord who's created this gap among the Benjamites. Oh, crikey, there's only 600 left and they haven't got any women. So what should we do? I mean, God's kind of, to me, it reads like, very much like people creating God in their own image in this bit, which is probably blasphemous, but hey, it doesn't tell me much about the relationship of this creator, all-loving, forgiving God with the humanity that he created. They created. Anyway.
That's roughly what I was going to say anyway.
Yeah.
But also the reflections in, there's this, again, sounds blasphemous, almost the writers are those that win. You win the battle, you create God in your image. And basically, we're still doing it today. The Israelites are doing it in Gaza, and Trump's doing it in America.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think both those points are, where is the love in this passage? Where would we place Jesus in this story? And in many respects, I know what Phyllis Tribble does is kind of place that idea of suffering servant on the concubine and on the women. And it's that sense that actually within this story, we focus on the men so much that actually we almost negate the women, that they're not part of the story, but they are the story. And I think that's kind of part of the way to read it, is actually this is the story of abuse against women. And I agree, and God told me, yeah. That's right. Yeah. And I think that's why the Bible is handled with care, because you could justify anything by looking through that text and saying, well, actually, do you know what? Women, it's clear in the Bible, women don't matter because God allows them to get killed in that way, and the Benjaminites and all that, and they need wives, and the women are just kind of the second class kind of citizens. But the reality is, I think when I read this story and it kind of really grates on me, kind of really bashes up against me, is that bit, history is written by the winners. And there is a parallel in Judges, to Judges, and to Kings. There always is that parallel story that says, well, this is what they thought, but actually, this is what really happens. This is where God is. He might not be in that book and that event, or they might see it in that he's winning the battle, because the battle's won, therefore God must have been on our side. And all the people that we don't like, I mean, I find it kind of ironic that, Saul is from that Benjaminite tribe. That actually, the Benjaminites are these bad, wicked people, but actually when they pick a king, they pick Saul. And then David. I mean, God picks David, and the story is, that obviously they don't want a shepherd boy, they want somebody that's going to do something. But that idea of almost saying, we have to that's there, and we have to read it, and we don't have to necessarily empathize. The story there brings us, as we talked about, empathizing with that concubine who is the suffering servant. She is beaten for my transgressions. Because the master doesn't stop at Jebus, it ends up in her paying the price. And how many people in our society are like that? They suffer because of our actions or our decisions or our choices or the choices of those in power that have over them.
I think the handle with care that we started off with, I mean, this story must just sort of exemplify why that's so essential.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, in a sense,
Mm.
is there?
Mm.
Yes, what happened on October the 7th was horrific. With 1,000, Jewish people.
Yeah.
So no one gets, but then, Israel's got a right to defend itself. 40, 50, 60, 70,
Yeah.
and the list goes on.
Mm.
And there's still people willing to defend it.
Mm.
And I find that incredible.
Yeah. 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 I think sometimes we think of these stories and we see them in the distant past, and then it doesn't take long for us to turn and see a parallel within our world today. And we could argue, well, they're winning. Or we could look at it and say, well, history is written by the winners. And actually, does this sound like the God that I know? And I think for me, that's the beauty of Christianity, is that it's not just a case of we know God because we read about him. We know God because he's here in us. We feel that Spirit of God within us. We know the Spirit of God within us. So we look at these passages and we're horrified, and we can recognize that is not God in that story. God is not making those people win. They're winning and therefore attributing it to their God.
That doesn't sound like God breathed, does it?
No, but except it's a yeah.
It's basically the message that you leave humans to their own devices,
And they yeah.
you get
Yeah.
a cycle
Mm.
of people being good and then they're falling, going into exile,
Yeah.
and then recovering, getting to a high point, and that's what's happened throughout
That theme, yeah. Yeah.
that I'm reading from
Yeah.
It's all about that cycle.
Yeah.
Constant cycle of people going away from God, and then this
Mm.
happens, and it's a message about
Yeah.
you turn away from God, and
Yeah.
this is what inevitably happens.
Mm.
It's laced throughout human history.
Yeah. Much.
Crusaders again,
Yeah.
the same thing.
Yeah.
They justified what they did by saying God gave us the victory.
Yeah.
But what made me think was that, again, what did Jesus say in it? Forgive your brother 70 times.
Mm. Yeah.
Don't just do an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth.
Yeah.
Pray for those who persecute you.
Mm.
That, again, it gives a real life to how that must have been received when you
Mm.
said,
Yes.
oh, yeah, pray for
Yeah.
them, blah, blah, blah. I heard it 100 times. In this context of this society
Mm.
where vengeance and honour are massive,
Yeah.
to have Jesus popping up and saying, pray for those who what?
Yeah.
Mad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty mad.
Yeah. Yeah. I love you,
Neighbour.
neighbour. Oh. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, absolutely. So that idea of when Jesus comes into that kind of that worldview and says, forgive your enemy, forgive them 70 times 7, all of those things. It's revolutionary speak. It's and we still say I think that's the most difficult commandment that we have, is that sense of forgiveness. And also there's a responsibility there, isn't there? I mean, in that whole story, the master takes no responsibility at all for any of the actions that have occurred. And yet it was him that pushed her out the door. And then said, oh, it's terrible. Well, if you didn't want that, don't push her out the door. Don't say, oh, she was raped and pillaged and killed, and but how bad on me. Well, you created that situation because you put her out there in the first place. So then when you say that thousands of armies are going to come and destroy everyone, well, really, there's a responsibility there as well, isn't there?
Well, I would have said the man, he's lost his moral compass. I mean, you can't do that kind of thing. You really cannot. I mean, it's almost, he's got no conscience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's you're right. I would say he's got no conscience, because we're coming from where women aren't property. I mean, I feel like I'm property to her.
No, I was just going to say, the account, it appears in that account that everybody kind of feels the same way. Not that everybody would have done what the the gang of people did, but that actually that was the most acceptable response. But I am sure that there would have been thousands of people hearing about that story, or who would have had a different opinion, because maybe that's just not the wishful thinking. But I don't believe that even though people in power or certain people would have done that, and maybe people did that out of fear, and it just comes across that he was just totally callous. But I don't believe that everybody would have had the same opinion. So I think sometimes it's making points that it's like totally bad, and that there's nothing salvageable from it. But I do think there would have been good people even in those times.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, it's 9 o'clock, so I think. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming these 5 weeks, 5 sessions. I'm going to go home into a darkened room and collapse. Yeah. But yeah, thank you. It's been really good for me as well to kind of do the research and to wrestle and to hear kind of everybody's conversation as well. And thank you for all your inputs, because it does make it, and it does kind of, we learn from one another. And I think that's really important, that we have that open dialogue and that sense of being able to air what we think about all passages, and especially those that are a bit darker. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.